Boy, oh boy, Season 14 is here, and I couldn't be more excited because we finally got some much needed changes to the weapon meta, and after some testing, I've come up with a tier list to give you an idea on which guns will be worth using to improve and reach your goals. I try my best to be objective here, and a lot of this list will be based on stats, ease of use, ammo, attachment economy, and general consistency, and I just want to warn you, this was very difficult to do. These changes really shook things up, so I tried my best to be objective here, but here goes nothing. But before we get into the tier list, just know we won't go over the care package guns because they are obviously S++++ tier, and I don't think we really need to know how good they are. Come on, they're cracked. It's pretty straightforward. And real quick, if you haven't already, make sure to head over to GameLeap and get a huge 50% discount by using code Season14 at checkout. This will give you instant access to hundreds of videos, guides, and breakdowns so that you can climb the ranks faster in this new season. So make sure to click the link down below right now, or else the hostess with the mostest will come haunt you in your sleep tonight. First up, I feel like I'm having deja vu because at the very bottom of this list, we have the EVA 8. Just kidding, we all know where that's going already. No, at the very bottom of our tier list, we've got the L-Star. While it did receive some very slight buffs, it's still very gimmicky, requiring you to really pay attention and pace your shots. It's got the same low DPS, as all they changed was its bullet velocity and made it overheat with 24 bullets instead of 20 when you have no mag equipped. Oh, and the rave lights coming from the gun were toned down a little, so I guess that's good too, but really not quite enough to get it out of D tier if you ask me. But I will say, it's actually pretty okay off the drop. Next up, I know some of you are gonna hate me for this, but both the RE45 and P2020, even with hammer points, the laser, and recent fixes to the RE45 simply aren't enough to make them any higher than C tier because there's not a single reason to take them over SMGs. The main problem with both of these pistols is that they have too many conditions that need to be met for it to be about 80% of what you could get from an SMG. You need hammer points, and your target has to have no armor to even come close to an SMG's output, and the RE45 still is not better than the car in that department, which has a higher DPS and higher damage per magazine, while the RE45 just barely has a higher DPS than the R99 and does about the same amount of damage per magazine. Again, this is only when you have hammer points and if they have no armor. If you come up against an SMG user and you both hit your shots, you are not going to have a good time. I'm just letting you know now. Not to mention, one of the main benefits pistols had over SMGs was the strafe speed, but now with how insanely accurate SMGs are with hipfire due to the laser sight, that argument becomes completely invalid, as now strafe speeds will be exactly the same when hip firing with SMGs, and even when you are ADSing with the RE45, it's all the same. And yes, it's faster to reload with pistols by roughly about 10%, which is about 0.1 to 0.2 seconds. I don't think I'd be being objective if I said that that was a good enough reason to really put it higher on this list. The Mozambique, on the other hand, is a little different. It's slightly better than the RE45 and P2020 because you really only need the bolt for it to have a decent performance. The hammer points are just icing on the cake. The problem is that some find it difficult to use, and in this sense, it's sort of the opposite of the other pistols. However, now, especially with recent EVA 8 buffs, there's no reason to take the Mozam over any other shotgun, as they have a much higher one-shot potential and just about the same in regards to difficulty. And finally, to round off our C tier, we have the triple take. The fact that you have to charge the shots to get something consistent going, combined with its very slow 78 rounds per minute compared to the 3030's 140 rounds per minute, makes this gun very underwhelming. I will say, at the start of the game, it can be great, but that can be said about all the guns we've listed so far. As the game goes on, all of these guns really start to fall off because other options just become more efficient and effective, and the case is not any different for the triple take, especially considering the G7's on the floor now and all the changes to the 3030. Next up, for our B tier, we have the Hemlock. This is another gun I know people think is slept on, but again, we have to ask ourselves, should, not would, but should you ever take the Hemlock over any one of the other ARs? The answer is no, with the exception of whether or not you are able to use a Havoc without a turbocharger, or if you are simply so uncomfortable with the other ARs that you have no option but to use the Hemlock. But I'd still tell you to go pick up an R301 and get comfy with it because R301 is insanely good. The problem with the burst weapons in Apex is that the game is highly reliant on movement much more than other games. Full auto gives you a stream of consistency, while burst weapons often will leave you only hitting a few bullets out of your burst, then you are stuck waiting to hit your next burst and are proceeding to get a full constant stream of bullets on you by that sweaty TTV Wraith doing a 360 backflip, tap straight, quad kick flip into a super glide. Jokes aside, larger, varied, and sudden movements do be a big problem for burst weapons, just saying. Simply due to the mechanics of the gun, unless it has a very short burst delay, which the Hemlock does not. The exception would be for controller users, as aim assist helps significantly with this, but even then, the movement still has the ability to break aim assist in many cases, and the further away you get, the weaker the aim assist gets, and the Hemlock is mostly only good at mid-range, but at long range it really falls off, and even at close range, especially with the recent hipfire nerfs, it's just not up to par. All this means it really lacks versatility on top of the issues that it already has. I'm not saying you can't use it, but it will cause you to run into the problem players getting away due to the slow pacing of shots and movement as the lobbies become more and more difficult as you go and improve. Even It's Timmy had that issue in his Hemlock video, and we all know that dude is absolutely cracked. Again, I'm not saying you can't use it. If you love the gun, by all means, just know you are handicapping yourself by doing so. A similar thing can be said for the next weapons on our list, the Sentinel and the Longbow. With the 3030 and G7 on the ground now, it's hard to justify picking up a Longbow or Sentinel because the faster fire rates, increased mobility, and versatility across ranges of those marksman weapons just makes these two snipers feel very bland and underwhelming. And yes, even with the skull piercer rounds, the Longbow still falls behind. I know people think it can 2-tap red armor, but that's only if they have no helmet. But if they have red armor, they probably are going to have a helmet, and it's probably going to be purple, I'm just saying. And with a purple helmet, it'll require 3 headshots, and at that point is where the other marksman weapons really start to take the lead because they're easier to use or more forgiving because of the faster fire rate, and with the 3030, it only takes 1 more shot to get that kill compared to the Longbow, so the faster fire rate really does pay off here. Alright, next up we have the Prowler, and before you guys start pointing me to the Moki Sniper video of him hip firing it from miles away in the firing range, you need to keep in mind that both him and the target are standing still. That's not going to happen in actual matches, I'm sorry to say it. And if you get beamed from a mile away with the Prowler, that means you need to be moving more. It suffers from the same issue as the Hemlock, except that it has a really strong hip fire that gives it a little bit more range than it had before compared to previously just aiming down sights, which is still pretty bad with this gun. I will say, for controller players, this may be a bottom A tier, but as a whole, I think it's safe to keep it in top B because we need to remember the other SMGs got the hipfire buff too, and if you haven't tried them yet, their hipfire is absolutely insane as well. So I'd much rather have something that's going to be more consistent that also has good ADS and hipfire. It's just they're just better. I'm sorry. If we see that this gun becomes meta within this season, I promise you I will eat my words and I will buy you all the cheesecake that you want. Now, speaking of other SMGs with insane hipfire, we've got the Alternator at the bottom of A tier. I know this will be a little controversial due to how low the DPS is, but hear me out. The Alternator's hipfire is absolutely crazy now and still is very easy to use while aiming down sights, making it insanely versatile. It also has the highest damage per mag out of all the full auto SMGs. On top of that, it is extremely good at mid to long ranges against ARs, even against the R31. However, that's only if you know how to do it correctly. So how do we do this? Well, it's with movement, and that is the caveat here. This gun gains more and more value against other guns based on your level of movement. If you are good at dodging bullets, you will win most SMG fights simply due to having a much higher damage per magazine. The same goes for when you are up against ARs, which all you have to do is alternate between hipfire, ADS, and the secret is crouch hip firing during your strafes. This is because crouching significantly reduces your hip fire spread for a short duration while also making your strafing very erratic, which, just as a quick bonus tip, that is a good workaround for the recent AR nerfs, but it isn't nearly as effective as the SMGs, just keep that in mind. But most AR players will simply just ADS and strafe in mid-range fights rather than trying to make their movement crazy because it messes up their aim if they try to. The problem with that is AR ADS strafe is insanely slow and makes you way too easy to hit, and that is why the Alternator can be really effective at mid-range against ARs and even against SMGs due to its ease of use combined with the mobility. This tactic is actually really easy to do once you practice it a little, so it's not like you have to be a movement god, which is why I think it deserves to be A tier this time around. Let me know in the comments below if I should burn to the stake for this decision. Please don't hurt me. All right, I'm not gonna lie. I was actually tempted to put our next gun below the Alternator, but if I'm being honest with myself, I don't think that would be right. That gun is the car. I know people are mad about the car not being able to use barrels or lasers, but I honestly think they made a good decision here. Trust me, I was a day one car lover even when everyone swore the R99 was better for almost that entire season. I knew it was going to become meta once people learned how to use it. Finally, people realized how strong it actually was, and literally it was the only SMG to use by far. It was leagues ahead of the other SMGs, and that is why I'm happy with the nerf. They made it a high-risk, high-reward weapon. The best DPS and handling out of all the SMGs with added versatility of its ammo mechanics and probably the best fire rate to damage ratio in the game. But at the cost of requiring mastery to use. This has always been the gun's identity from the very beginning, so I'm glad they nerfed it in a way that would not take away from its identity. It is still a really good SMG, but it also won't be running rampant and allows a lot more breathing room for the other SMGs to shine, and it's still a great option to use. Alright, next up we have the turbocharged devotion. Honestly, nothing has changed with it, and it has stupid high DPS, and with the recent hipfire nerfs to assault rifles, this gun indirectly got a buff when in close quarters against AR users. As I said before, with LMGs they have high damage per magazine, usually with a low DPS, but the devotion has the highest full auto DPS in the game. It can be really strong against any gun while hip firing, as it simply out damages and outlasts them, even against SMGs in many cases. It also works well at mid-range, but where it starts to fall off is longer ranges due to its difficulty to control. But again, with those things combined, it really does deserve to be an A tier, as long as you have a turbocharger. Next up, we have the Spitfire. The recoil got nerfed more on the Spitfire, and I'd say it's just about as difficult to use as the Flatline, meaning great at mid-range with a very high damage per magazine, but falls off at longer ranges. Its hipfire spread is bad, but again, it has the ability to significantly outlast other close quarters weapons, so it can still work decently in this area. Honestly, not much else to say about this one except that I'm happy it got a little nerf, but wasn't anything too crazy. And those of you who think it fires faster because it's light ammo, no, it doesn't. The only thing that has changed is its ADS recoil. Overall, let's be honest, it's still pretty easy to control, and it has that insanely high damage per magazine, and that's really what's keeping it up here. Next up, we have the charge rifle. As much as I'd love to bring all the charge rifle Charlies down a peg, it still hits scan, oppressive, and way too easy to use. Plus, it actually got a slight indirect buff since sniper ammo now comes in stacks of 28 instead of 24, and one of the main problems with the charge rifle was it sucked up ammo like it was nothing. Small buff, but a buff nonetheless, keeping it in the A tier, not any higher due to its lack of versatility, however, because let's be honest, that thing is really terrible at close range, like really bad. And as the circle gets smaller, it starts to lose value more and more. Compare that to other long range weapons like the 30-30 or G7, which actually can still work pretty well in mid to close ranges, if you can hit your shots. Alright, now the Havoc has also taken a hit due to its hip fire, and you can definitely feel it. But this is plus the fact that it needs a turbocharger is what's keeping it from being an S tier. It's pretty much lost all of its close range capability due to how strong SMGs and shotguns are now. However, it's still probably the strongest mid-range gun in the game due to its insanely high damage per magazine and it being the highest DPS assault rifle. But because of its somewhat loss in versatility, it lost its previous place in S tier, which can also be said about the Flatline. The Flatline's main benefit over the R301 was its hipfire and higher damage per magazine. However, now with it getting hit with a nerf in the previous season, reducing its DPS to 180, it was 190 before, which was about the same as the R301 currently, and its nerf to hipfire this season pull this gun out of S tier. The question is, why take the Flatline when you could take a Volt that does the exact same DPS, is insanely accurate at range, more so than the Flatline. It doesn't require any gimmicky mechanics like jitter aiming, and it's extremely effective in close range with its new hipfire attachment, and it has faster strafe speeds, again like the alternator, making it really effective against ARs at mid-range. Overall, the Volt is way more versatile, and that is probably the main reason why the Flatline got taken out of S tier. But don't get me wrong, the Flatline is still amazing. It is still top A tier for sure. And if you know how to do that technique that we were talking about earlier, the alternating between hipfire, crouching, and ADS, that can really help with the AR's nerf to their hipfire. It is definitely something you need to learn, especially if you like using the Flatline. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's the moment you've all been waiting for, S tier. And it might come as a surprise to you, but first up, we have the R99. The only thing that kept the R99 low on everyone's tier list was because of the car, but now with the car being nerfed, the R99 has its time to shine. The hipfire is incredibly good, especially with the laser, and I'd even say it's on par with the alternator. However, it also has a DPS of 198, which is really high. For reference, the car is 202 DPS, so it's actually not too far behind. The R99 is really easy to use while still having a higher fire rate, which allows you to flinch enemies more. It is probably the best SMG up close for a majority of players due to its accuracy, high fire rate, and raw damage output, but the reason it's at the bottom of S tier is because its handling is a little slower than other SMGs and also has the lowest damage per magazine being 300. But it is really easy to be consistent with this gun. If you're having a hard time with it because maybe you're first starting out, just give it some time. Once you get used to it, it is extremely easy to be accurate with this gun from close to mid ranges. ranges. And if you combine that consistency with extremely good DPS, that is what's keeping it here in the S tier. Alright, I have to say this. Did I not tell you this was going to happen in the last weapon video? I don't want to say I told you so, but I told you so. Everyone is talking about the 30-30 now with good reason. This gun is basically just a wingman that's better at ranged. The catch is that in order for it to be more versatile is you have to be good with its hipfire at close range, which actually isn't that hard to do with some practice. If you can Peacekeeper, you can 30-30 up close no problem. However, because it does require the Skull Piercer for the most benefit and isn't as easy to use up in close quarters as the G7, and it being a little less forgiving, I think the G7 will likely provide more value to most players, but the 30-30 will probably perform better in the skilled player's hands overall. Personally, I will be taking the 30-30 every time. Which brings us to our next gun, the G7, which all in all is a really well-rounded gun. It's extremely easy to use and is very forgiving with its 240 rounds per minute. It also works pretty well if you get caught off guard in close range, as the hipfire is strangely decent. This gun is very good at poke damage though, and can work well at pretty much all ranges. Its versatility, ease of use, and ammo economy easily brings it to S tier. Personally, I think using it in single fire mode seems to be much more effective and forgiving. However, I have seen some decent results with the hop up as well, but keep in mind, it's still that burst, man. Next, we have the Peacekeeper and EVA 8. Really nothing has changed here for the Peacekeeper except for the fact that the EVA 8 actually gives it a run for its money. When it comes to the EVA versus the Peacekeeper, I think it will largely come down to preference. However, the Peacekeeper has a higher one-shot burst potential on cracked targets, so if you have good aim, this is a very rewarding shotgun to use. But for consistency, it's hard to say that the Peacekeeper will outperform the EVA. Without the hop up, the EVA 8 has a lot of room for error with a high damage output. With the hop up, it becomes very similar to the Peacekeeper, except if you miss one of the shots while aiming, there is a chance you will hit the second one. The great thing about the EVA 8 is that you can switch between the double tap mode, meaning you can have both the more consistent mode and the higher burst potential whenever you want. I really do think that the EVA 8 is going to pull further ahead than the Peacekeeper as the time goes on, but only time will tell. And of course, next up is the Wingman. Even with its nerf to its economy, it's actually not that bad. With the Wingman, you really only needed 1 to 2 stacks, taking up 1 to 2 slots of your inventory. Now at most, you will really only need 1 extra slot and you'll be fine. This nerfs its ability to carry too many nades while using it, but just barely. Again, you really only need 1 additional slot now, and if you're combining it with a shotgun, then you can still carry an insane amount of heals or nades. I think this change is good as it doesn't nerf it to the ground, but helps keep it in check a little bit because it was starting to run a little rampant there. Come on, let's be real. Other than that, it's still the exact same gun with the ability to use the Skull Piercer rounds now, or the boosted loader, so you technically have more options than before. On top of that, the boosted loader should be easier to find now that its quality has dropped down to epic, but let's be honest, it was pretty easy to find already. Next up, we have the R301. While its hipfire was slightly nerfed, that's about it. It still has a higher DPS than the Volt, it's way too easy to use, and extremely accurate, so it's not as affected by the Volt like the Flatline was. It's a little less versatile, but I actually found that its hipfire was a little better than the Flatline now. The main difference is that you feel it more if you miss shots due to its lower damage per magazine. Overall, still, it's the #1 AR easily. I don't think anybody is questioning that. And finally, at the very top, we have the Volt. As I said earlier, it's basically just a better version of the Flatline in almost every way. It's far more versatile than both the R301 and Flatline, it's got better handling than them, you strafe faster, its DPS is equal to the Flatline with a higher fire rate, making it more forgiving, and on top of all that is insanely easy to use both ADS and with hipfire. I don't know about you, but this is probably going to be my main gun for this season, and if you haven't tried it yet, I promise you, you're sleeping on something. So, do you agree with this tier list? What would you change? Should I burn at the stake? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. This has been John A, and I'll see you in the next one.